Sometimes the loneliest souls are the ones with the biggest hearts. Elijah Kane had spent 15 winters alone in these mountains, cut off from the world, with nothing but memories and regrets for company. On a December night when the blizzard hit hard enough to bury the past, he found two small creatures huddled beneath a fallen pine, shivering and close to death. They weren't bear cubs. They were covered in dark reddish-brown fur, with eyes that looked almost human. Against everything he knew, Elijah brought them into his cabin and kept them warm through that endless night. He had no idea their family was searching for them. When dawn broke, and he heard the sounds outside his door, Elijah realized his simple act of kindness had changed everything. What happens when you save something the world says doesn't exist? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains had a way of marking time differently than the rest of the world. Down in the valleys and towns, people measured their days by church bells and train schedules, by the opening and closing of shops, by the predictable rhythm of civilization. Up here, where Elijah Kane had made his home, time moved with the sun and the seasons, with the migration of elk and the first frost on the pines. 15 years he'd lived this way, and he'd grown to prefer the mountain's clock to any timepiece made by human hands. His cabin sat in a small clearing halfway up the western slope of what the maps called Sentinel Peak, though Elijah had never seen a map that showed his exact location. That was intentional. When he'd come here all those years ago, he'd wanted to disappear, and he'd succeeded better than he'd ever imagined possible. The cabin itself was solid work, built from lodgepole pine he'd felled and hewn himself. 2 rooms, the main living space with its stone fireplace and a smaller back room for sleeping. The roof was steep to shed the heavy snows, and he'd chinked the walls tight enough to keep out all but the most determined wind. It wasn't much, but it had been enough. More than enough, really, for a man who'd stopped expecting anything from life. The morning routine never varied. Elijah woke before dawn, as he always had, even back when he'd had a reason to rise early. He'd build up the fire from the banked coals, set the coffee pot on to boil, and while the cabin warmed, he'd step outside to read the mountain's mood. This morning, the morning that would become the last normal morning of his life, though he didn't know it yet, the air had a strange quality to it, sharp and still, with a heaviness that spoke of weather coming. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the clouds sat low over the peaks to the north. He stood on his porch in the pre-dawn gray, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, and felt the mountain's warning in his bones. A storm was building. A bad one from the feel of it, the kind that could bury a man's cabin to the eaves if he wasn't careful. Back inside, he poured his coffee into a tin cup and sat at the rough-hewn table that occupied one corner of the main room. This was when he performed his morning ritual, the one act that connected him to the past he'd tried so hard to leave behind. From his shirt pocket, he withdrew a tarnished silver pocket watch. The case was worn smooth from years of handling, and when he pressed the catch, it opened to reveal a face frozen at 3:47. The hands hadn't moved in 15 years. They never would. The mechanism had broken long ago, or perhaps it had simply decided to stop, to mark that one moment and hold it forever. Elijah wound the stem anyway, as he did every morning. 3 careful turns, no more, no less. It was pointless, he knew. The watch would never run again, but the ritual mattered. It was his way of acknowledging what he'd lost, of carrying it forward into each new day. The watch had belonged to his father, and it had stopped at the exact moment the old man had died, 28 years ago now. Elijah had been carrying it in his own pocket 15 years later, when his wife Sarah had taken sick, when his daughter Emma had followed her mother into the ground just 3 weeks after. The watch had kept ticking through all of that, indifferent to his grief. But something in Elijah had stopped nonetheless, had frozen just as surely as those hands at 3:47. He closed the watch and returned it to his pocket, then drank his coffee and tried not to remember. That was the trick to living up here alone. You had to learn not to think too much. Keep your hands busy, your mind occupied with the immediate tasks of survival. There was always work to do. Firewood to split, game to hunt, repairs to make. The mountain demanded constant attention, constant effort. That was good. That was what he needed. After breakfast, cornmeal mush with a bit of honey he'd traded for in town last month. Elijah dressed for the day's work. Heavy wool shirt, canvas trousers reinforced at the knees, his father's old coat that he'd patched and repatched until it was more patch than original fabric. He pulled on his boots, well-oiled and broken in, and took his rifle from the pegs above the door. Not that he expected trouble, but a man alone in these mountains didn't take chances. Outside, the day had lightened to a dull grey. The storm was still hours away, but he could feel it pressing down from the north. He'd need to secure everything, bring in extra firewood, make sure the animals in his small lean-to shelter, 2 mules and a handful of chickens, had feed and water to last through a few days if necessary. He set about these tasks with the methodical efficiency of long practice. The mules, Gus and Martha, nickered softly when he entered the shelter. He'd had them for 7 years now, stubborn creatures both, but reliable. They were his only connection to the town of Timber Ridge, 20 miles down the mountain. 4 times a year, he'd load them with furs and the results of his trapping, and make the long journey down to trade for the supplies he couldn't make or grow himself. Flour, salt, coffee, bullets, a few other necessities. The townspeople regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and pity. The hermit from the mountain, the man who'd lost everything and run away from the world. He didn't correct their assumptions, let them think what they wanted. Their opinions didn't reach him up here. By midday, he'd brought in enough wood to last a week, stacked tight against the cabin's north wall under the overhang. He'd checked his traps, nothing today, and shot a young buck that he dressed and hung in the cold room built into the hillside behind the cabin. The physical labor felt good, kept the ghosts at bay. But as the afternoon wore on, and the light began to fail early under the thickening clouds, Elijah found his thoughts drifting back, despite his best efforts. Sarah had been the daughter of the mill owner in a town 3 valleys over. Elijah had been working as a logger then, strong and young, and full of plans for the future. She'd been beautiful in a quiet way, with dark hair she wore in a long braid and eyes that seemed to see right through to a man's heart. They'd married within 6 months of meeting, and Emma had come along a year later. Those had been good years. Hard work, simple pleasures, a family to come home to at the end of each day. He'd thought that was how life would go, steady and predictable, with Sarah beside him and Emma growing up strong and capable. The fever had come in the spring, brought in by travelers from the east. It had swept through the town like fire through dry grass. Sarah had caught it first, and despite everything the doctor tried, despite Elijah's prayers and Emma's tears, she'd slipped away after 4 days of suffering. Emma had been next. She was only 8 years old, with her mother's dark hair and her father's stubbornness. She'd fought harder than Sarah had, lasted almost a week. But in the end, the fever took her too. Elijah had buried them in the town cemetery, side by side under a spreading oak. He'd stood at their graves for a long time, unable to cry, unable to feel anything but a vast and terrible emptiness. The townspeople had tried to help, had offered sympathy and support and assurances that time would heal his wounds. But Elijah hadn't wanted their sympathy. He'd wanted his family back, and since he couldn't have that, he'd wanted nothing at all. So he'd left. Sold everything he owned, bought supplies and mules, and headed into the mountains. He'd kept going until he couldn't hear the sound of other people, until the silence was so complete it felt like a physical presence. And here, in this clearing halfway up Sentinel Peak, he'd stopped. He'd built his cabin and learned to survive, and he'd tried very hard not to feel anything ever again. But the heart is a stubborn thing. Even when you think you've buried it, even when you've wrapped it in silence and solitude, it keeps beating. And sometimes, on mornings like this, when the routine ritual of winding a broken watch brought everything rushing back, Elijah had to admit that he was still capable of pain. The wound hadn't healed. It had just gone quiet. The wind picked up as evening approached, bringing the first scattered flakes of snow. Elijah stood on his porch and watched them fall, tiny white specks against the darkening sky. The temperature was dropping fast now, and the air had that peculiar quality that promised a serious storm. He'd weathered plenty of blizzards in his years up here. They were dangerous if you weren't prepared, but if you had shelter and supplies and the good sense to stay inside, they were just another part of mountain life. He went back inside and lit his lamps, then set about making supper. Venison stew with potatoes and wild onions, biscuits in the Dutch oven. He ate alone at his table, as he always did, and tried not to notice the empty chair across from him. After the dishes were washed and put away, he sat by the fire and worked on repairing a torn leather strap from one of his pack saddles. Outside, the wind was howling now, and the snow was falling in earnest. The storm had arrived. Elijah had always found a strange comfort in blizzards. The way they cut you off from everything made your world shrink down to the immediate space around you. Inside the cabin, with the fire crackling and the lamps burning, he was safe. The storm could rage all it wanted outside, but it couldn't touch him here. He was alone, yes, but alone in a way that felt almost protective. The mountain wrapped around him like a blanket, and the snow falling outside was a curtain between him and all the painful memories of the world below. He should have known that nothing lasts forever. Not safety, not solitude, not the careful walls we build to keep the world at bay. The mountain had been his refuge for 15 years, but on this night it was about to ask something of him. Something that would crack open the protective shell he'd built and force him to feel again, to care again, to step back into the stream of life he'd been avoiding for so long. But he didn't know that yet. As he banked the fire for the night and prepared for bed, Elijah Kane was still just a lonely man in a cabin, convinced that he'd left all the complications of human connection far behind. The storm outside was just weather, the wind just wind. The sounds in the darkness, just the normal chorus of a mountain night. He had no idea that two small lives were fighting for survival out there in the killing cold. He had no idea that by morning, everything he thought he understood about these mountains and about himself would be forever changed. He pulled off his boots and lay down on his narrow bed, listening to the wind shriek around the cabin's corners. Tomorrow, he thought, he'd dig out from the snow and get back to his routine. The traps would need checking, assuming they weren't buried. The mules would need tending. Life would continue in its simple, solitary pattern. Tomorrow, he thought, would be just another day. He was wrong about that, too. The storm hit with full fury just after midnight. Elijah woke to the sound of wind hammering against the cabin walls, a relentless roar that made the sturdy logs creak and groan. Snow was coming down so thick that when he looked out the window, he couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the glass. The world had disappeared into a wall of white. He'd seen bad storms before, but this one had a different quality to it. Meaner somehow, more determined. The kind of blizzard that could kill a man in minutes if he was caught out in it. Elijah added wood to the fire and checked that his shutters were secure. Nothing to do now but wait it out. The mountain would show its temper, and then it would calm down, as it always did. That was the rhythm of life up here, but sleep wouldn't come back to him. Something felt wrong, though he couldn't put his finger on what. A tightness in his chest, a restlessness in his limbs. He found himself pacing the small cabin, pausing at the window every few minutes to peer out into the howling darkness. Just weather, he told himself. Just a storm like any other. But his instincts, honed by 15 years of solitary survival, kept insisting otherwise. Around 3 in the morning, he heard something. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then it came again. A sound that didn't fit with the storm's natural chorus. High-pitched, almost like crying, but not quite. Not human, but not animal either. Something in between. Elijah stood by the door, listening hard. There it was again, barely audible over the wind. A wailing sound, thin and desperate. Every rational part of his brain told him to ignore it. Going out in this storm would be suicide. Whatever was making that sound was beyond his help. The mountain was full of creatures, and not all of them survived the winter. That was nature's way. Harsh, but honest. But the sound came again, and this time he heard something in it that bypassed all his rational thoughts and went straight to a deeper place. It sounded like a child crying, like Emma used to cry when she'd had a nightmare and called for him in the dark. His hand was on the door latch before he'd made a conscious decision. He pulled on his coat and boots, wrapped a scarf around his face, and took his lantern from its hook. The wind nearly tore the door from his hands when he opened it, and the cold hit him like a physical blow. The temperature had dropped to brutal levels, and the snow was falling so hard it was like standing inside a cloud. He should go back inside. This was madness. But that sound came again, clearer now, and it was coming from somewhere to the east of the cabin. Elijah raised his lantern and pushed forward into the storm. The wind tried to shove him back toward the cabin, and the snow stung his exposed skin like thrown needles. He could barely see 3 feet ahead, and the drifts were already knee-deep in places. Each step was a struggle, and within minutes his legs were aching from the effort. The cold was starting to work its way through his layers, searching for skin. He almost missed them entirely. The lantern light caught something dark against the white, a fallen pine blown over by the wind, and beneath it, huddled in the small shelter created by its branches, 2 small shapes barely visible in the snow. Elijah knelt down, brushing away the accumulating drifts, and his lantern revealed what he'd found. 2 small creatures, no bigger than human infants, covered in thick reddish-brown fur that was now matted with ice and snow. They were curled together, shaking violently, their eyes closed against the cold. Not bear cubs, he'd seen plenty of those. These were different. The shape of their faces was wrong, too flat, with features that seemed almost human. Their hands, he could see small hands with distinct fingers, opposable thumbs, clutched at each other for warmth. One of them opened its eyes as he leaned closer, and Elijah found himself staring into a gaze that was undeniably intelligent. Not the blank stare of an animal, but something more. Something that looked back at him with awareness, with fear, with desperate hope. His mind reeled. What were these things? Where had they come from? But those questions didn't matter right now. What mattered was that they were dying, freezing to death in this storm, and he was the only one who could help them. One of them was clutching something against its chest, a small leather satchel, crude but clearly crafted with intention. The leather was like nothing Elijah had seen before, thick and water-resistant, with strange symbols pressed into its surface. He reached for it, but the creature's grip tightened, a soft whimper escaping its throat. "It's all right," Elijah heard himself say, though he had no idea if the thing could understand him. "I'm going to help you." He took off his coat and wrapped both creatures in it, gathering them carefully against his chest. They were so cold, their small bodies rigid with hypothermia. He didn't know if they would survive, even if he got them back to the cabin. But he had to try. Something in their eyes, that desperate, intelligent pleading, wouldn't let him walk away. The journey back to the cabin was harder than the journey out. The creatures added weight, and the storm seemed to have intensified, as if angry at his interference. Twice he lost his bearings completely and had to stop, trying to find the faint glow of his cabin windows through the blinding snow. His legs burned, his lungs ached from breathing the frozen air, and his face was numb despite the scarf. But finally there it was, the solid outline of his cabin emerging from the white chaos. He stumbled up the porch steps and through the door, slamming it behind him against the wind. Inside, the warmth felt almost painful after the brutal cold. Elijah laid the creatures down near the fire and quickly added more wood to build up the heat. They were in bad shape, barely moving, their breathing shallow and rapid. He'd seen hypothermia before in animals, and once in a trapper who'd fallen through ice. You had to warm them slowly, carefully. Too fast, and you could do more harm than good. He got blankets from his bed and wrapped them around the small bodies, rubbing gently to stimulate circulation. He heated water and tried to get them to drink, just a few drops at a time. One of them, the slightly larger of the two, managed to swallow. The other seemed too far gone, its breathing so faint that Elijah had to lean close to be sure it was still alive. For hours he worked, through the rest of that endless night, trying to bring warmth back into their frozen bodies. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain. Inside, by the fire's glow, Elijah found himself caring again, trying again, hoping again. Emotions he'd thought were dead and buried. The smaller one stopped breathing just before dawn. Elijah felt its tiny chest go still beneath his hand, and for a moment he was back in Emma's room, watching his daughter take her last breath while he held her hand and tried to pray. The old grief rose up in him like a physical thing, threatening to drown him. But then the creature gasped, a shuddering, desperate intake of air, and started breathing again. Elijah nearly wept with relief. He kept working, kept warming, kept willing these strange beings to live. As the first grey light of dawn filtered through the windows, the creatures finally began to respond. Their shivering became less violent. Their breathing steadied. The larger one opened its eyes and looked at Elijah with that same intelligent gaze. And this time there was recognition in it, understanding. It made a soft sound, almost cooing, and its small hand reached out to touch Elijah's arm. He examined them more carefully in the growing light. They were covered in dense fur, except for their faces, palms, and the soles of their feet. Their features were a strange blend, flat faces with prominent brow ridges, small noses, mouths that could almost be human. Their hands and feet were more developed than any ape he'd ever heard described, with fingers and toes that moved with clear dexterity. The larger one was maybe 2 feet tall, the smaller perhaps 18 inches. Infants, he realized. These were children of whatever species they belonged to. The leather satchel had fallen free during his warming efforts. Elijah picked it up and examined it in the firelight. The symbols pressed into its surface were unlike any language he'd encountered. Not Native American, not anything from any culture he knew of. They seemed to form patterns, possibly words, but in a script that might be centuries old, or might be something else entirely. Inside the satchel were a few objects. A smooth stone carved with more symbols, what looked like dried berries or seeds wrapped in a leaf, a small piece of what might have been carved bone. Nothing that helped him understand what these creatures were or where they'd come from. The larger infant reached for the satchel, and Elijah gave it back. The creature clutched it to its chest and settled down against the blankets, its eyes drooping with exhaustion. The smaller one curled against its companion, and within moments both were asleep. Elijah sat back on his heels and stared at what he'd brought into his cabin. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Stories came back to him, tales he'd heard around campfires and in saloons, dismissed as superstition and drink-fueled fantasy. Stories about wild men in the mountains, creatures that walked upright but weren't human. Forest giants, some called them. The natives had different names for them, treated them as spirits or guardians of the deep wilderness. He'd always thought such stories were just that, stories. Every frontier had its legends, its tall tales, designed to keep people away from certain places or to explain things they didn't understand. But here, sleeping by his fire, were 2 creatures that shouldn't exist, according to everything he thought he knew about the world. The storm was finally beginning to ease outside. The wind's howl had dropped to a steady moan, and through the window Elijah could see the snow was falling less heavily. The worst had passed, but as he sat there watching these impossible beings breathe and sleep, he had the distinct feeling that a different kind of storm was just beginning, because these were infants, which meant somewhere out in these mountains there were adults. Parents who would be looking for their lost children. And when they came looking, if they came looking, what would they find? A human stranger sitting in a cabin with their young. Elijah thought about the stories again, the descriptions of creatures 8 or 9 feet tall, impossibly strong, fierce in the protection of their own. He thought about how he would feel if Emma had been lost in a storm and he'd found her in a stranger's home. He looked at the rifle hanging above the door, then back at the sleeping infants. No, whatever came looking for these little ones, he wouldn't greet it with violence. He'd done what any decent soul would do, saved lives that needed saving. He'd have to trust that the parents, whatever they were, would understand that. If they came, when they came. Because as Elijah watched the dawn light strengthen and heard new sounds from outside, heavy sounds, purposeful sounds, the sound of large things moving through snow, he knew with sudden certainty that they were already here. The first light of dawn revealed what the storm had hidden. Elijah stood at his window, coffee growing cold in his hand, staring at the tracks that surrounded his cabin. They were massive, easily 18 inches long and nearly as wide, pressed deep into the fresh snow. The stride length between them suggested something that stood far taller than any man. There were multiple sets, coming from different directions, all converging on his small clearing. They'd been here in the night, circling while he slept, while the infants recovered by his fire, watching, waiting. The creatures by the fireplace were awake now, making soft, chittering sounds to each other. When Elijah approached, they fell silent, watching him with those disturbingly intelligent eyes. The larger one clutched the leather satchel protectively, but there was less fear in its gaze than there had been. It seemed to understand, on some level, that he'd saved them. Elijah moved slowly, keeping his hands visible and his voice low. "I need to check on you," he said, knowing they couldn't understand the words, but hoping his tone would convey his intentions. "Make sure you're healing right." He examined them both carefully. Their fur was dry now, fluffed up and remarkably thick. The smaller one had some frostbite on its toes. The skin beneath the fur was discolored, but it didn't seem to be causing much pain. The larger one was in better shape, though both were clearly exhausted from their ordeal. He offered them water and some dried berries from his supplies. They accepted the water but sniffed at the berries suspiciously before taking them. All the while, Elijah was aware of the presence outside. He couldn't see anything when he looked out the windows, but he could feel it. The weight of attention, of multiple pairs of eyes watching his cabin. The infants seemed to sense it too. They kept looking toward the door, making soft calls that might have been attempts at communication. He had to make a decision. The way he saw it, there were two choices. He could keep the infants inside and wait to see what happened, possibly provoking a confrontation when the watchers lost patience. Or he could take the initiative, acknowledge what he knew was out there, and return the children himself. The second option scared him more than he wanted to admit. But it was also the right thing to do. These weren't his to keep. They belonged with their family, and their family was out there waiting. Elijah pulled on his coat and boots, then picked up his rifle. He hesitated, then put the rifle back. Taking a weapon would send the wrong message. He needed these beings, whatever they were, to understand that he meant no harm. He took a deep breath, then scooped up the two infants, wrapping them in a blanket. They squirmed in his arms, but didn't try to escape. The larger one looked up at him and made a questioning sound. "It's time to go home," Elijah said softly. "Your family's waiting for you." He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was still brutally cold, the sky a pale blue after the storm's fury. Fresh snow covered everything, pristine and unmarked, except for those massive tracks leading away into the trees. At first, he saw nothing but forest. Then movement caught his eye, shadows shifting among the pines. One by one, they emerged from the tree line, and Elijah's breath caught in his throat. There were 7 of them. The smallest stood maybe 7 feet tall, the largest close to 9. They were covered in thick fur, ranging from reddish-brown to nearly black, their bodies massive and powerful. They walked upright with a slight forward lean, their arms longer than human proportions, their shoulders incredibly broad. But it was their faces that struck him most, flat and wide, with prominent brow ridges, but with expressions he could read: worry, fear, desperate hope. The largest one, clearly the father, was at the front of the group. His fur was nearly black with silver streaking through it, and his eyes were a deep brown that locked onto Elijah with an intensity that made him want to step back. But Elijah held his ground, kept his body language as non-threatening as possible. The infants in his arms suddenly came alive, crying out with obvious recognition. They squirmed and reached toward the group, their calls becoming more insistent. The reaction from the adults was immediate. Several of them surged forward, but the big male held up one massive hand, stopping them. He approached alone, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. As he got closer, Elijah could see the anguish in those brown eyes, the barely controlled emotion. This was a father who'd thought his children were lost, who'd spent the night searching through a killer storm, refusing to give up hope. Elijah descended from the porch slowly, taking one step at a time. The male stopped about 10 feet away, watching every movement. Up close, the creature was even more imposing. Probably 8.5 feet tall, with arms that could easily tear a man apart. But those eyes remained focused on the infants, not on Elijah. They were lost, Elijah said quietly, not sure why he bothered to speak, but feeling like he should. Caught in the storm. I heard them crying and brought them in to warm them up. They're all right now. A little frostbite on the small one's toes, but nothing serious. The male's gaze shifted to meet his, and Elijah had the unsettling feeling that the creature understood more than he should. There was recognition there, acknowledgement of what had been said, even if the words themselves had no meaning. Elijah took another step forward and held out the bundled infants. "Take them," he said. "They belong with you." For a long moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. The watching clan members, the infants squirming in the blanket, Elijah with his arms extended, the massive male standing between worlds. Then, with movements that were surprisingly gentle, the father reached out and took his children. The reunion was remarkable to witness. The male cradled both infants against his chest, his massive hands impossibly careful. The infants clutched at his fur, making sounds that were clearly joy and relief. Behind him, the rest of the clan moved forward, females who Elijah assumed were the mothers, rushing to touch the returned children, to assure themselves they were real and alive. There was crying, actual tears streaming down faces covered in fur. There were sounds of relief and happiness that transcended species. It was a family reunited, and watching it, Elijah felt his own eyes burning. He thought of Sarah and Emma, of what he would have given for one more chance to hold them, to have them return to him, safe and sound. The big male turned back to face him. For a moment, Elijah thought the creature might simply leave, might take his children and disappear back into the forest as mysteriously as they'd appeared. But instead, the male carefully handed the infants to one of the females and approached Elijah again. Elijah stood his ground, though his heart was hammering. The creature was close enough now that he could smell him, an earthy, musky scent, not unpleasant. Close enough that he could see the scars on the massive chest, marks that spoke of a hard life in an unforgiving wilderness. Close enough that one swing of those long arms could end his life, but the male didn't attack. Instead, he reached into the thick fur at his neck and drew out something hanging on a leather cord. He pulled it over his head and held it out to Elijah, a stone medallion, roughly circular, about 4 inches across. It was carved with intricate patterns, symbols that matched those on the infant's satchel, but more elaborate, more refined. The craftsmanship was incredible, the stone polished smooth and the carvings precise. Elijah took it slowly, turning it over in his hands. It was heavier than it looked, the stone cool and dense. The carvings caught the morning light, creating shadows that seemed to shift and move. "I can't," he started. But the male made a sound, something between a grunt and what might have been speech, and gestured insistently. This was not a request. It was a gift that could not be refused. Elijah slipped the cord over his own head, feeling the weight of the medallion settle against his chest. The male nodded, a very human gesture, and his expression, if Elijah was reading it correctly, held both gratitude and something else. Respect, maybe. Recognition of a debt acknowledged and repaid. The creature raised one massive hand and placed it gently on Elijah's shoulder. The touch was brief but meaningful, a connection between two fathers who understood loss and love and the fierce imperative to protect the helpless. Then he stepped back, gathering his family with gestures and soft vocalizations. The clan moved as a unit back toward the tree line, the females carrying the infants, the males forming a protective circle around them. But before they disappeared into the forest, the big male turned back one last time. He looked at Elijah for a long moment, then raised his hand in what could only be interpreted as a wave, a gesture of farewell, of thanks, of acknowledgement that something significant had passed between them. Then they were gone, melting into the forest as silently as they'd appeared, leaving only those massive tracks in the snow as evidence they'd ever been there. Elijah stood in his clearing for a long time after they'd vanished, the medallion heavy against his chest, his mind trying to process what had just happened. The sun was climbing higher now, melting frost off the pine branches, and the world looked exactly as it always had. But everything was different. Everything had changed. He went back inside and sat heavily at his table, the medallion in his hands. The carvings were mesmerizing, patterns that seemed to tell a story, though he couldn't begin to interpret it. The stone itself was like nothing he'd seen in these mountains, dark grey with flecks of what might be mica catching the light. This was real. They were real. The stories weren't just tall tales designed to scare greenhorns or explain away strange sounds in the night. There were people, beings, living in these mountains that the world knew nothing about. Or maybe the world had known once and forgotten. Maybe that's what all those old stories were, memories of a truth that civilization had chosen to ignore. Elijah set the medallion down and picked up his father's pocket watch, winding it out of habit. The hands stayed frozen at 3:47, as they always did. But something felt different this morning. The ritual felt less like mourning and more like honoring. His father had lived his whole life in these mountains. Had he known? Had he encountered these beings? The old man had never said anything, but he'd been a quiet soul, keeper of his own counsel. The day passed in a strange haze. Elijah went through his normal routines, tending the mules, checking the trap lines, splitting more wood, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept looking toward the forest, half expecting to see those massive shapes moving among the trees. But there was nothing, just the normal sounds of the mountain, the wind in the pines, the occasional call of a jay or crow. It was only as evening approached that he noticed the offerings. Someone had been to his cabin while he was out checking traps. On his porch were 3 fresh-killed rabbits, cleaned and ready for cooking. Beside them was a small bundle of roots he didn't recognize and what looked like strips of dried meat wrapped in leaves. The clan was still watching, still nearby, and they were offering gifts in return for the one he'd given them, the gift of their children's lives. Elijah picked up the offerings carefully and brought them inside. The rabbits would make a fine stew. The roots, he'd have to experiment to figure out how they were meant to be prepared. The dried meat he tried a small piece of and found it surprisingly good, with a smoky flavor unlike any game he knew. That night, sitting by his fire with a full belly and the medallion warm against his chest, Elijah felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. A connection to something beyond himself, a sense of belonging to this place that went deeper than mere survival. He'd saved 2 lives in that storm, but in doing so, he'd also saved something in himself. Some part that had frozen 15 years ago when Sarah and Emma died, leaving him hollow and cold. The infant's desperate need had cracked that ice, and what flowed through the crack was the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could care again. That maybe there was still a purpose to his existence beyond simply waiting to die. Outside, under a sky brilliant with stars, the mountain held its secrets close. But now Elijah was part of those secrets, bound to them by a medallion of carved stone, and the memory of intelligent eyes looking at him with gratitude. 3 days passed, and Elijah found himself unable to stop thinking about the encounter. He went about his daily tasks with only half his attention, the other half drawn constantly to the forest, watching for any sign of the clan. The offerings continued to appear, sometimes food, once a beautifully woven grass mat that was warmer and more water-resistant than anything he could have made himself. Each gift was left when he wasn't looking, placed carefully on his porch or near his woodpile. He started leaving his own offerings in return. Not on the porch where they'd be too close to human space, but at the edge of the clearing near the tree line. Coffee, which he suspected they'd never tasted. Salt, precious and hard to come by. A good skinning knife he'd made himself. The offerings were always gone by morning, and something new would appear in their place. It was a careful dance, this exchange, neither side pushing too close, both acknowledging the other's presence and expressing gratitude. Elijah found himself looking forward to discovering what the clan had left, what they'd chosen to share from their world in response to what he'd shared from his. On the fourth day, he made a decision that surprised him. He went to the back of his cabin where he kept his father's old trunk, a battered wooden chest he hadn't opened in years. Inside were the remnants of his father's life, old clothes, a few tools, some papers and documents. Elijah dug through them carefully, looking for something he half remembered from childhood. There, at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, he found it. A leather-bound journal, the pages yellowed with age, but the writing still clear. His father's journal from his years working these mountains. Elijah had looked at it once, years ago, shortly after his father's death. Back then, it had seemed like nothing more than notes about weather and game trails, observations about the best places to hunt or trap. He'd set it aside and eventually forgotten about it, but now, with the medallion heavy around his neck and the memory of those intelligent eyes fresh in his mind, he looked at the journal with new understanding. He settled at his table with a fresh cup of coffee and began to read. The early entries were exactly as he remembered. Practical notes, observations about the mountain's patterns and moods. But as he read deeper, moving through the years his father had spent up here, the tone began to change. References appeared that he'd missed before, or maybe hadn't been ready to understand. Saw the tall ones again today, near the North Ridge. They'd been watching the valley. Makes me wonder what they see that I don't. Found tracks by the creek, massive like a man's, but twice the size. Fresh prints heading up toward the high caves. Left some tobacco at the usual place. It was gone this morning, replaced with 3 perfect arrowheads made from obsidian. Never seen work that fine. The old female came close today. Sat maybe 30 yards off while I worked my trap line. We looked at each other for a good long while. There's understanding in those eyes, sure as I'm alive. She knew I'd pulled the trap that would have caught her young one. Knew I'd reset it further down, where only game would find it. There's a rightness to them, a way of being that we've forgotten. Elijah read on, fascinated and disturbed. His father had known. For years, his father had been aware of the clan's presence, had interacted with them in small ways, had protected their secret. Why had he never said anything? Why had he kept this truth hidden even from his own son? The answer came in an entry dated about a year before his father's death. Thomas Brennan came through yesterday, full of whiskey and big talk about forming a hunting party. Said he'd seen something up near Sentinel Peak that wasn't natural. Wanted to track it down and prove the old stories true. I steered him wrong, sent him east where there's nothing but elk and bear. But it got me thinking about what would happen if word really got out. Men would come, hunters, scientists, curiosity seekers. They'd tear these mountains apart looking for proof. The clan would have to go deeper, maybe disappear entirely, or they'd have to fight. Either way, they'd lose the life they've built here. Some secrets protect themselves by staying secret. Some truths are safer left unspoken. I'll carry this knowledge to my grave, if that's what it takes to keep them safe. Elijah sat back, his father's words echoing in his mind. The weight of the secret his father had carried. The deliberate choice to protect beings that the world would call monsters or myths. And then he found the final entry, dated 3 days before his father's death. The clan's leader, I call him Keeper in my mind, though that's not his name, came to the cabin today. First time he's come so close. He brought a map, drawn on doeskin with incredible detail. Showed me the forbidden territories, the places where his people live and raise their young. Asked me in his way to keep others away from those places. I gave my word, carved my mark on a tree at each boundary, a warning to myself and maybe to my boy if he ever comes to understand. This is their land, always has been. We're the newcomers here, the intruders. But Keeper says there's room for both if we respect each other's space. I believe him. I'll do what I can to honor that belief. The entry ended there. 3 days later, his father had died. The official story was that he'd fallen while checking a trapline, hit his head on a rock. His body had been found by another trapper a week later. Elijah had always accepted that explanation. Accidents happened in the mountains, even to experienced men. But now he wondered. There was one more item in the trunk, something he'd overlooked before. A folded piece of doeskin, soft and supple despite its age. Elijah opened it carefully and found himself looking at a map, the same one his father had described in his journal. It showed the mountain ranges in remarkable detail, with certain areas marked with symbols he now recognized from the medallion. The forbidden territories, the clan's home ground. Small marks that must have been his father's hand showed where he'd carved warnings into trees. Boundary markers respected by both sides. And there, in the western corner of the map, was a notation that made Elijah's breath catch. His father's handwriting, "My son's cabin, if he chooses to stay." Good place. Keeper approves. His father had known that Elijah would come to these mountains seeking solitude, had perhaps even guided his choice by leaving certain clues, certain suggestions before he died. And Keeper, the same massive male who'd come for the infants, had approved of Elijah's presence even before he arrived. This changed everything. His 15 years of isolation hadn't been accidental. The clan had been watching him all along, allowing him to be here, seeing in him perhaps an echo of his father. The offerings, the careful distance they'd maintained, it all made sense now. They'd been waiting to see if he was like his father, if he could be trusted with their secret. And the storm, the infants, that had been the test. Not intentional, perhaps, but a test nonetheless. How would he respond when confronted with their existence? Would he protect or exploit? Help or harm? He'd passed. The medallion around his neck was proof of that. But it was also responsibility, a weight he hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. His father's legacy, passed down through Keeper's hands to his own. Elijah spent the rest of that day studying the map, memorizing the forbidden territories. He wouldn't go there, that wasn't his right. But he needed to know where they were, needed to be able to steer others away, as his father had done. The thought of taking on that role, of becoming a guardian of secrets like his father before him, should have felt burdensome. Instead, it felt right. It felt like purpose. That evening, as the sun set and painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of orange and pink, Elijah walked to the edge of his clearing. He stood there for a long time, looking into the forest, and he felt their presence. Not threatening, just aware. Watching as they'd probably watched his father for years. "I understand now," he said aloud, not sure if they could hear or comprehend, but needing to speak the words anyway. "What my father promised you, I promised too. Your secret is safe with me." The forest was quiet but not empty. Never empty. And as Elijah turned back to his cabin, he caught movement in the corner of his eye, a massive shape standing in the shadows between the trees. Just for a moment, then gone. But long enough for him to see the raised hand, the gesture of acknowledgement Keeper had heard. And he understood. That night, Elijah added his own entry to his father's journal, continuing the record, accepting the legacy. He wrote about the storm, the infants, the reunion. He wrote about the medallion and the map and what he'd learned about his father's secret life. And he ended with a promise, written in his own hand, but echoing his father's words. "I will carry this secret as long as I live. I will protect their territories and steer others away. They are not monsters or myths. They are people, living their lives in the only way they know how. If my father taught me anything, it's that some mysteries are worth protecting, some truths are worth keeping silent. I'm my father's son, and I will honor his promise. This is my oath." He closed the journal and set it beside his father's pocket watch. 2 legacies, 2 inheritances. When marked the moment, time stopped. the moment loss became permanent. The other marked the moment it started again, the moment isolation became connection. Outside, the mountain settled into its night rhythms. And somewhere in the darkness, a clan of forest people slept peacefully, knowing that the son of their old friend had proven himself worthy of trust. Elijah lay in his bed that night, with the medallion warm against his chest and his father's map carefully folded beside the journal. For the first time in 15 years, he felt like he belonged somewhere, like he was part of something larger than his own grief. The loneliness that had defined his existence was still there, but it had shifted somehow, transformed from an empty void into a watchful solitude with meaning behind it. Sleep came easier than it had in years, and his dreams were full of forests and distant figures moving through ancient trees, guardians of a world that existed just beyond the edge of human knowing. A month passed, and winter settled into the mountains with the patient weight of something that knew it had time. The snow deepened, the temperatures dropped, and the world contracted to a realm of white and grey, and the dark green of pines bent under their frozen burdens. It was the kind of winter that tested a man's resolve, that made even the most hardened mountain dwellers question their choices. But Elijah found himself more content than he'd been in years. The exchanges with the clan continued, growing more frequent and personal. He began to recognize patterns in what they left, certain types of plants that appeared when he was running low on coffee, suggesting they understood his needs. Firewood would appear, stacked neatly, on days when his shoulder ached too much from old injuries to swing an axe efficiently. They were watching, learning, caring for him as he'd cared for their young. And then one morning, he found fresh tracks leading right up to his porch. Not the whole clan this time, just one set. The largest set. Keeper had come alone in the night and left something different. A woven fiber blanket, unlike anything Elijah had ever seen. It was made from materials he couldn't identify, plant fibers perhaps, but processed in some way that made them incredibly soft, yet remarkably strong. The weave was so tight it was nearly waterproof, and when he wrapped it around his shoulders, he was stunned by its warmth. It wasn't just warm, it was almost hot, as if the fibers themselves generated heat. He examined it closely and found what looked like thin strands of something else woven throughout, catching the light with a subtle shimmer. Whatever the clan had used to make this, it was beyond his understanding. A technology or craft that went back generations, maybe centuries. That night was particularly cold. The kind of cold that made his cabin's walls groan and frost form on the inside of the windows despite the fire. Elijah wrapped himself in the blanket and felt its unnatural warmth seep into his bones. It saved him from frostbite that night, he was certain of it. The gesture wasn't just a gift, it was protection, an acknowledgement that winter was dangerous, even for those who knew it well. The next morning, he left his best steel trap at the offering place, along with a note he knew they couldn't read, but wrote anyway. "Thank you. You saved my life." The trap was gone by evening, and in its place was a small carved figure, a human and one of the clan standing side by side, about 4 inches tall and beautifully detailed. The message was clear. They were allies now, partners in survival. As the weeks went on, Keeper began appearing more regularly, always at dawn or dusk, always keeping a respectful distance, but growing gradually closer. They couldn't speak in any conventional sense, but they developed a language of gestures and expressions that bridged the gap. Keeper would point to different parts of the mountain, making sounds that Elijah came to understand as warnings or invitations. "Come here. Stay away from there. Danger. Safety." One morning, Keeper approached closer than he ever had before and gestured for Elijah to follow. It was an invitation, clear as day, and after only a moment's hesitation, Elijah nodded and grabbed his coat. He left the rifle behind deliberately, wanting to show trust. Keeper led him through the forest along paths Elijah had never noticed, moving with a silence that seemed impossible for something so large. They climbed higher into territory the map had marked as forbidden, and Elijah's heart raced with the honor of it. He was being shown something precious, something secret, They emerged into a hidden valley that took Elijah's breath away. A waterfall cascaded down the far cliff face, somehow still flowing despite the cold. The water forming a pool that steamed in the frigid air, a hot spring, Elijah realized, fed by geothermal heat deep in the mountain. Around the pool, the snow had melted, revealing patches of green where plants grew even in the dead of winter. But it was what else filled the valley that made Elijah stop and stare. Structures. Not buildings exactly, but carefully constructed shelters woven from branches and covered with hides, built into the natural formations of rock and tree. Dozens of them, a whole community hidden away in this secret place. And between them, moving about their daily lives, were more of the clan than Elijah had imagined existed. Adults tended fires and worked on various tasks. Young ones played in the snow, their games not so different from human children's games, chasing, wrestling, building things, and knocking them down. Elders sat together near the warm spring, their fur silver with age, their movements careful and deliberate. It was a society, a culture, a whole way of life that had existed here for who knew how long, completely unknown to the outside world. Keeper made a sound, and several of the clan looked up. For a moment Elijah felt a flash of fear. He was alone here, surrounded by beings who could tear him apart if they chose. But Keeper placed a massive hand on his shoulder, a gesture of protection and introduction, and the others relaxed. They returned to their tasks, though many watched him with curious eyes. Keeper led him through the settlement, showing him their way of life with obvious pride. He saw tools more sophisticated than he'd expected. Stone implements, yes, but also items that spoke of deep knowledge and careful craft. Baskets woven so tightly they held water. Pottery fired in kilns built into the cliff face. Weapons for hunting, spears with obsidian points that would rival any human-made blade. But more than the physical items, Elijah saw the social structure. The way the younger adults deferred to the elders, the way everyone helped with communal tasks, the tenderness with which parents cared for their young, the respect shown to those who were injured or infirm. They took care of their own, and they did it with a grace and efficiency that human communities could learn from. Keeper brought him to one structure larger than the others, and inside, Elijah found what could only be described as a meeting hall. The walls were covered in paintings, images that told stories spanning generations. He saw the clan hunting great beasts that no longer walked these mountains. He saw them fleeing from something, a migration of some kind. He saw them making peace with other groups, establishing territories, building their hidden communities. And then Keeper showed him the newer paintings, the ones that included humans. There was his father, rendered in remarkable detail, standing beside a younger Keeper. The painting showed them together at what looked like a boundary marker, hands raised in a gesture of agreement. Farther along the wall was another painting, this one recent, so recent the pigments were still slightly wet. It showed Elijah himself, holding two small figures, with Keeper reaching out to receive them. Elijah's eyes burned looking at it. They'd honored him, put him in their history, made him part of their story. He turned to Keeper, not knowing what to say, and the massive being nodded with what Elijah could only interpret as approval. They left the settlement as the sun began to set, and Keeper brought him back to familiar territory. At the edge of Elijah's clearing, the big male paused and pulled something from the pouch at his waist. It was a handful of seeds carefully wrapped in a leaf. Keeper placed them in Elijah's palm and pointed to the ground, making a planting gesture. Then he pointed to his mouth, a clear message. Food! These could be grown and eaten. Elijah nodded his understanding and carefully pocketed the seeds. But before Keeper could leave, he caught the being's attention and pulled out his father's map. He pointed to the forbidden territories marked on it, then to himself, and shook his head firmly. Keeper watched closely as Elijah took a stick and drew in the snow, a representation of other humans approaching, and himself standing in their way, turning them aside. Understanding lit Keeper's eyes. He nodded slowly, then did something unexpected. He reached out and tapped the medallion hanging around Elijah's neck, then placed his massive hand over his own heart. The gesture was clear. "You wear our symbol. You are family. We trust you to protect us as we protect you." The weight of that trust settled over Elijah like the woven blanket, warm but heavy with responsibility. He nodded solemnly, and Keeper grasped his shoulder one more time before disappearing into the darkening forest. That night, wrapped in the miraculous blanket, Elijah thought about what he'd seen. A whole world existed just beyond the edges of human knowledge. A society of beings who'd found a way to live in harmony with the mountain, who'd built a culture based on mutual support and respect for their environment. They had art, social structures, technology adapted to their needs. They had families and traditions, and a deep connection to this place that went back further than any human settlement. And they were vulnerable, desperately vulnerable to exposure, to the violence and greed that could come if the wrong people learned of their existence. His father had understood that, had spent years keeping that secret. Now it was Elijah's turn to stand guard. The responsibility should have felt overwhelming, but instead it felt right, like finding the missing piece to a puzzle he hadn't known was incomplete. For 15 years he'd been hiding from life, from connection, from purpose. Now he had all three, given to him by beings who walked upright but lived closer to the earth than any human he'd known. He took out his father's journal and added more notes, descriptions of what he'd seen, details he wanted to remember. And he made himself a promise. Whatever it took, whoever came, he would protect them. The clan had given him back something he'd thought lost forever. A reason to care, a family to protect, a purpose beyond mere survival. Outside, the wind picked up, bringing fresh snow. But inside, wrapped in impossible warmth and surrounded by the evidence of a secret history, Elijah felt more at peace than he had since Sarah and Emma had died. The loneliness was still there, but it was a chosen solitude now, a watchful waiting instead of empty despair, and somewhere in the hidden valley, Keeper was telling his people about the human who could be trusted, who wore their symbol and understood their need for secrecy. Building bridges between worlds, one gesture at a time. The threat came 6 weeks after Elijah had first found the infants. It arrived in the form of survey stakes driven into frozen ground at the southern edge of his territory, bright orange flags snapping in the wind. He found them while checking his trap lines, and his stomach dropped at the sight, railroad markers. He'd seen them before, years ago, when the companies had been pushing west through the lower valleys. They meant progress, profit, the unstoppable march of civilization. They also meant destruction of habitat, displacement of wildlife, and the arrival of hundreds of workers who would scatter through these mountains like ants. Elijah pulled up the stakes and carried them home, but he knew it wouldn't matter. More would come. The survey teams would be back, and eventually the construction crews. The railroad companies had money and political backing, and they didn't let a few missing stakes slow them down. That night, Keeper appeared at the edge of the clearing, his presence urgent. He gestured for Elijah to follow, and they went together to the boundary markers his father had carved years ago. Keeper showed him more survey stakes, dozens of them, running in a line that would cut right through the hidden valley where the clan lived. The big male's distress was palpable. He made sounds that Elijah had learned to interpret as questions, concern, fear. "What does this mean? Are we in danger?" Elijah wished he could explain, could soften the truth, but he had to be honest. He nodded grimly and drew in the snow, a picture of what a railroad meant. The destruction, the noise, the influx of humans. Keeper's reaction was immediate. He gathered branches and demonstrated what Elijah interpreted as a plan to relocate, to go deeper into the mountains where humans wouldn't follow. But Elijah shook his head. How far would they have to go? And what would they find there? Other territories, other dangers, starvation in less hospitable lands? No, there had to be another way. Elijah tapped his chest, then pointed to the survey stakes. He would stop this. Somehow he would find a way to stop it. The question was how. He was one man against a railroad company, backed by investors and politicians. He had no legal claim to most of this land, no standing to challenge their right to survey or build. All he had was determination and the memory of his father's promise. Some secrets protect themselves by staying secret. Some truths are safer left unspoken, except now the truth might be the only weapon he had. The next morning, despite the bitter cold, Elijah saddled up Gus and made the long ride down to Timber Ridge. The town had grown since his last visit. More buildings, more people, the smell of money and ambition in the air. He found the general store where he usually traded and learned from the proprietor that yes, the railroad company had bought rights to survey through the mountain range. Completion of the line would bring prosperity to Timber Ridge, make it a major shipping hub. Good for business, the proprietor said cheerfully, counting out Elijah's supplies. Good for everyone, unless you're one of those fools who thinks the wilderness should stay wild forever. Elijah didn't take the bait. He gathered information instead, who was running the survey, where they were headquartered, when they planned to start actual construction. Then he went to the land office and spent hours poring over dusty records and maps, looking for any legal angle he could use. What he found wasn't encouraging. The railroad had secured mineral rights and easements through most of the mountain range. There were a few parcels of private land, including his own small claim around the cabin, but not enough to block the route they'd chosen. They'd been careful, thorough, probably had lawyers who'd thought of every obstacle. Elijah was sitting in the cramped land office, frustration building, when he overheard a conversation between two clerks. They were talking about the survey team, making jokes about the strange reports they'd filed. Unusual tracks, they said. Equipment going missing. One surveyor swearing he'd seen something moving through the trees that couldn't possibly exist. Probably drunk, one clerk laughed. Mountain fever gets them all eventually, but the other clerk lowered his voice. My grandfather used to tell stories about these mountains. Said there were things up there that didn't take kindly to intruders. Old tribal legends about forest giants who'd protected these peaks since before white men came west. Superstitious nonsense, the first clerk scoffed, but Elijah's mind was racing. The clan wasn't invisible. The survey teams were already noticing signs of their presence, making reports that people dismissed as hallucinations or tall tales. How long before someone took those reports seriously? How long before curiosity brought hunters and fortune-seekers looking for proof of the impossible? He left Timber Ridge with more questions than answers and a growing dread in his gut. The ride back up the mountain seemed longer than usual, and the temperature dropped steadily as he climbed. By the time he reached his cabin, snow was falling again, and darkness was coming on fast. Inside, he built up the fire and sat at his table with his father's journal open beside him. He needed to think, to plan, to find some way to protect the clan without exposing them. But his thoughts kept circling back to the same impossible conclusion: there might not be a way. Progress didn't stop for one man's promises, and civilization didn't respect boundaries it didn't acknowledge. He was still sitting there, staring at the fire, when he heard a sound that brought him to his feet. Not Keeper this time, but something else. Voices, human voices, raised in argument, coming from somewhere north of his cabin. Elijah grabbed his rifle and coat and headed out into the snow. The voices grew clearer as he approached. 3 men, by the sound of it, and they were close to one of the boundary markers his father had carved. Too close to the hidden valley, he found them standing in a small clearing, studying a surveyor's map by lantern light. 3 rough-looking men in canvas coats, carrying equipment and rifles. One of them was pointing at the map, gesturing toward higher ground. "Evening," Elijah called out, keeping his voice level and his rifle pointed at the ground but ready. "You men are on private land." They turned to look at him, more annoyed than concerned. The one holding the map, clearly the leader, was a hard-faced man in his 40s with calculating eyes. "Private land?" "According to what claim?" "According to the claim I filed 15 years ago," Elijah said. It was mostly true. His claim covered some of this territory, though probably not exactly where they were standing. The leader smiled without warmth. "Then you'll have heard about the railroad company's easement. We have legal right to survey this entire range. I'm Garrett Mason, Chief Surveyor for Western Pacific Rail, and you are. "The man telling you to leave." Elijah took a step closer, noting how the other two men shifted their rifles. "This country's dangerous. Storm's coming. Best you head back down," Mason laughed. "We've been working these mountains for 2 months, old-timer. We know how to handle weather. But I appreciate your concern." His tone made it clear he didn't appreciate anything. "We'll be back in the morning to continue our survey. With or without your permission. Then you'll be trespassing. Then I'll have the sheriff escort us. This is happening, friend. You can cooperate or you can cause trouble, but either way, the railroad's coming through." One of the other surveyors spoke up, his voice uneasy. "Garrett, we should go. It's getting dark, and this place, there's something wrong about it." "Those tracks we found yesterday were bear tracks," Mason snapped. "Nothing more. Stop letting ghost stories spook you." But Elijah had seen the fear in the man's eyes. He'd seen something, or seen signs of something, and it had shaken him. Good. Maybe fear would keep them away. "There are things in these mountains," Elijah said quietly, "that don't take kindly to disturbance. Old things. My father used to say some places should be left alone, and he was right." Mason's expression hardened. "That sounds like a threat. It's a warning. There's a difference." For a long moment the two men stared at each other while snow fell around them. Then Mason gestured to his crew. "Let's go. We'll file a report with the company. Let them know we've got a hostile local who thinks he owns the mountain." They left, but Mason turned back one last time. "Nice medallion," he said, pointing at the carved stone visible at Elijah's collar. "Indian trinket. Worth something, probably. You might want to sell it while you can. Because in 6 months, these mountains will be full of workers, and trinkets and old claims won't mean much then." Elijah watched them disappear into the darkening forest, his hand tight on his rifle. When they were gone, he felt a presence behind him and turned to find keepers standing at the tree line. The big male had heard everything, had watched the confrontation. Their eyes met, and Elijah saw the question there. "Can you stop them?" He wanted to say yes. Wanted to promise that he'd find a way, that he'd honor his father's legacy and protect the clan no matter what it took. But he'd never lied to Keeper, and he wouldn't start now. "I don't know," he said aloud. "But I'm going to try. I promise you, I'm going to try." Keeper nodded slowly, then melted back into the forest. And Elijah stood alone in the falling snow, feeling the weight of an impossible promise settling onto shoulders that had carried nothing but grief for 15 years. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by his fire with his father's pocket watch in one hand and Emma's wooden doll in the other. The doll he'd carved for her 20th birthday before she'd gotten sick. He'd found it in his trunk weeks ago and hadn't been able to look at it since. But now he held it, let himself remember her laugh, her innocent questions about the world. She'd been 8 when she died. The 2 infants he'd saved couldn't be much older than that in their species reckoning. Young, innocent, deserving of a chance to grow up safe in the only home they'd ever known. He thought about the stories he'd told Emma when she was little, stories about heroes who stood up against impossible odds, who fought for what was right, even when they knew they might lose. She'd loved those stories, had believed in them completely, with a child's absolute faith in justice and happy endings. What would she think of him now? Would she be proud that he was trying to protect the helpless, or would she be disappointed that he'd run away from the world, that he'd wasted 15 years hiding from pain instead of facing it? Elijah set down the doll carefully, reverently, and made a decision. He'd spent 15 years being a coward, letting grief turn him into a ghost. But ghosts couldn't protect anyone. It was time to be a man again, to stand for something that mattered. The clan needed him. They'd trusted him with their secret, their safety, their children's lives. And he'd be damned if he'd let a railroad company destroy the only family he had left. He didn't know how he'd stop them, didn't know if it was even possible. But he knew he'd try, with everything he had, until there was nothing left to give. Outside, the mountain held its breath, and in the hidden valley, a clan of forest people slept uneasily, knowing that their world was about to change forever. For 3 days, Elijah wrestled with the problem, pacing his cabin and studying his father's maps until his eyes burned. He needed leverage, something that would make the railroad company think twice about their route. Legal challenges would take too long and probably fail. Physical resistance would get him arrested or killed. He was one man against an organization with unlimited resources and the law on their side. On the morning of the fourth day, Keeper appeared at his cabin door before dawn. The big male's demeanor was different, urgent, insistent. He gestured for Elijah to follow, and there was something in his eyes that made Elijah grab his coat without question. They moved quickly through the forest, heading deeper into clan territory than Elijah had been before. The sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when they reached a narrow ravine he'd never seen, hidden behind a formation of rocks that looked impassable until you were right on top of it. Keeper led him through the tight passage and into a cave mouth concealed by overhanging vines. Inside, the passage widened and descended, lit by shafts of dawn light filtering through cracks in the stone above. The walls were covered in paintings. Old. Ones far older than anything Elijah had seen in the settlement. These weren't the careful, detailed images he'd seen before. These were ancient, primitive, powerful. They showed the clan's history stretching back into time beyond measuring. But Keeper didn't stop at the paintings. He led Elijah deeper to a chamber at the back of the cave where the air was cool and still. And there, arranged with obvious care and reverence, were items that stopped Elijah's breath in his chest. A cairn of stones marked what could only be a burial site, and scattered around it, preserved by the cave's stable temperature and dry air, were objects that should not exist. Human objects. Old objects. Very old. Elijah knelt down, his hands shaking as he picked up a rusted flintlock rifle. The wood was gone, rotted away, but the metal action was unmistakable. Beside it lay what had once been a leather satchel, now mostly dust, but fragments remained showing craftsmanship from, he tried to date it in his mind, maybe 150 years ago. Earlier, there were more items. A cavalry saber with United States Army markings from before the Civil War, a prospector's pan, fragments of cloth that might have been a military uniform, and in the center of the cairn, placed with obvious honor, a small leather-bound book protected by oilcloth. Keeper made a sound and gestured to the book, then to Elijah. Permission granted. With trembling hands, Elijah unwrapped the oilcloth and opened the book. The pages were brittle with age, but still legible. It was a journal, written in English, and the first entry was dated March 15th, 1868. Elijah's heart stopped. March 15th, 1868, the date his father had died, the day his father's watch had stopped at 3:47 in the afternoon. He read the first page, and the world tilted. My name is Thomas Kane, and if you're reading this, it means my son has earned the trust I earned before him. Keeper, he who leads the clan, protector of the hidden people, has shown you this place. That means you're ready to understand the full truth. Elijah sat down hard on the cave floor, the journal clutched in his hands. His father's handwriting. His father's words, but dated on the day he died. He read on, and the story that unfolded was nothing like what he'd believed for 28 years. His father had been working a trapline on Sentinel Peak when he'd fallen through what looked like solid ground plunging 30 feet into a hidden ravine. The fall had broken his leg in 3 places and cracked several ribs. He should have died there, alone and helpless, unable to climb out or even call for help that could reach him. But Keeper had found him. A younger Keeper then, not yet the clan's leader, but already someone who understood that not all humans were threats. He'd climbed down to where Thomas lay, broken and bleeding, and instead of leaving him to die, which would have been safer for the clan, he'd carried him out, carried him gently, carefully, back to the hidden valley where the clan's healers could work on him. I lived among them for 6 months, the journal entry continued, long enough to heal, long enough to learn their ways, their language, their history, long enough to fall in love with them as a people. They are not savages, not animals. They are us, or what we could have been if we'd chosen a different path. They live in harmony with this land, taking only what they need, protecting each other with a fierce loyalty that puts our so-called civilization to shame. The entry went on to describe those 6 months in detail, learning to communicate, watching their social structures, understanding their deep connection to the mountain. And then came the part that made Elijah's eyes burn with unshed tears. When I was finally healed enough to return home, Keeper asked something of me. He showed me this cave, this sacred place where they keep the memories of humans who found them over the generations. Some of these humans tried to harm them. Those items were taken from hunters who came with violence in their hearts and paid the price. But some tried to help, tried to protect them. Those items are kept with honor. Keeper asked if I would be one of the protectors, if I would guard their secret, steer others away from their territories, ensure they could live in peace. I gave him my oath, swore on my son's life that I would keep their existence hidden. And then he showed me something that changed everything. Elijah turned the page with trembling fingers. There is a prophecy among the clan, passed down through generations. It's painted on the walls of this cave, older than any other marking they have. It shows a great conflict coming, a time when the human world and the clan's world will collide. It shows destruction and fire, the end of the hidden people's way of life. But it also shows hope, a human figure standing between two worlds, someone who will have to choose which side to protect. Someone who will understand both worlds and love both equally. Keeper believes this prophecy speaks of my bloodline. Not me, but my son or his children after him. He believes that the Cain family was meant to find them, to forge this bond, to be ready when the moment of crisis comes. I don't know if I believe in prophecy, but I believe in responsibility. I believe in honoring those who saved my life when they had every reason to let me die. So I've done as Keeper asked. I've marked the boundaries, kept the secret, steered hunters and prospectors away from clan territory for 27 years. But I'm dying. The fall damaged something inside me that the healers couldn't fix. I can feel it. A weakness in my chest, a pain that grows worse each month. I don't have much time left. And the prophecy says the crisis will come in the next generation. So I'm writing this down, hiding it where only someone trusted by Keeper will ever find it. If you're reading this, my son, it means you've proven yourself worthy. It means the clan has shown you their world, and you've responded with the same compassion and honor that saved my life all those years ago. The threat is coming. I don't know what form it will take, but Keeper has dreams, visions, maybe, of metal and fire, of humans swarming through these mountains like locusts. He's seen the future, or a possible future, and it terrifies him. The clan can't fight an army. They can't fight progress. All they can do is hide and hope that when the moment comes, there will be someone willing to stand between them and destruction. That someone is you, Elijah. I know you'll read this and think I'm asking too much, putting too much faith in prophecy and dreams. But I know my son. I know the good man you'll become, the strong heart you carry, and I know that when you see what I saw, their families, their children, their gentle way of life, you won't be able to walk away. The watch I'm leaving you will stop when I die. I know this somehow. The same way Keeper knows things he shouldn't be able to know. It will stop at the moment I leave this world, and you'll carry that frozen moment with you. But don't let that moment define you, son. Don't let my death stop your heart, the way my death will stop that watch. Live, love, protect those who can't protect themselves. And when the moment comes, when you have to choose between the easy path and the right path, choose right. Choose courage. Choose to be the bridge between worlds that the prophecy speaks of. I'm proud of you, Elijah. I was proud of you before you were born, and I'll be proud of you long after I'm gone. Honor my memory by honoring my promise to these good people. They deserve a chance to survive, to thrive, to continue their ancient ways in peace. Your loving father, Thomas Cain, written March 15th, 1868, in the Cave of Memories, with Keeper as my witness. The entry ended there. Elijah sat in silence, tears streaming down his face, holding the journal like it was made of spun glass. His father hadn't died in an accident. He'd come here, to this sacred cave, to write this letter, to leave this message for a son he somehow knew would need it. And then what? Had he simply walked out and let the weakness in his chest finally claim him? Had he died peacefully, knowing his life's work would continue? The journal didn't say, but Elijah could imagine it. His father lying down somewhere in these mountains, looking up at the sky, satisfied that he'd done what needed to be done. Keeper made a soft sound, and Elijah looked up to find the massive being watching him with ancient, knowing eyes. How old was Keeper? If he'd been young when Elijah's father fell into that ravine 28 years ago, he might be 50 or 60 now, old for his kind perhaps, but still strong and vital, and he'd been carrying this secret, this prophecy, this hope for a human savior, for all those years, waiting to see if Thomas Caine's son would prove worthy. Testing him first with small things, the offerings, the careful distance, the gradual revelation of their world. And finally, the ultimate test, the infants lost in the storm, helpless and dying. Would Elijah save them or leave them to freeze? He'd saved them. And in doing so, he'd fulfilled the first part of his father's promise. Now came the hard part. Standing between the clan and the railroad company's plans, being the bridge between worlds when those worlds collided. Elijah stood slowly, his legs unsteady. He looked at the items scattered around the cairn, the rifle, the saber, the prospector's pan, evidence of humans who'd found the clan over generations. Some had tried to harm them and failed. Others had tried to help and were honored for it. He placed his father's journal carefully back on the cairn, wrapped in its protective oilcloth. Then he removed his father's pocket watch from his vest and held it up to the dim light filtering into the cave. 3:47, the moment his father's heart had stopped beating. The moment a promise had been made that would span generations. With careful reverence, Elijah placed the watch on the cairn beside the journal, not as an offering of surrender, but as an acknowledgement. The past was the past. His father's watch would stay frozen at 3:47 forever. But Elijah's time was now, moving forward, racing toward a confrontation that had been prophesied before he was born. Keeper stepped forward and placed one massive hand over his heart, then extended it toward Elijah, a gesture of profound respect and gratitude. Then he moved to the cave wall and pointed to the ancient paintings Elijah had only glimpsed on the way in. They approached together, and in the growing light of dawn, filtering through the cracks above, Elijah saw the prophecy his father had described. The images were primitive but powerful, stick figures representing the clan, threatened by symbols of fire and destruction. Metal beasts on wheels, trains, he realized with a chill. The prophecy had predicted the railroad, and there, in the center of the painting, a human figure standing with arms outstretched between the clan and the destruction. One hand touching the clan, the other raised against the threat. The figure wore something around its neck, a circular symbol that looked remarkably like the medallion Elijah wore. The prophecy wasn't vague or symbolic. It was specific. It had always been about this moment, this choice, this confrontation between the clan's world and the railroad's progress. Keeper made a sound, something between a question and a plea. He pointed to Elijah, then to the painting, then back to Elijah. "Are you the one? Will you stand for us?" Elijah looked at the prophecy, at the human figure that might represent him or his father, or perhaps the spirit of anyone willing to stand against impossible odds. He thought about the infants he'd saved, about the community he'd seen in the hidden valley, about the gentle giants who'd trusted him with their greatest secret. He thought about Emma, asking him to tell her stories about heroes, about Sarah's gentle insistence that doing the right thing mattered more than doing the easy thing. He thought about 15 years of running from responsibility, from connection, from life itself. "Yes," he said aloud, his voice echoing in the sacred cave. "I'm the one. I'll stand for you. I don't know if I can stop them, but I swear I'll try with everything I have." Keeper understood, even without comprehending the words. He moved to a stone shelf at the back of the cave and retrieved something wrapped in hide. With careful movements, he unwrapped it to reveal a knife, but not just any knife. It was his father's hunting knife, the one he'd carried for 40 years. The blade was still sharp, the handle carved from antler, the leather grip worn smooth by decades of use. There was dried blood on it, old and dark. Keeper held it out to Elijah, and understanding crashed over him. This was what his father had used at the end. Not to harm himself, but to mark himself, to make a blood oath in a way the clan would understand as sacred and binding. His father had died honoring his promise, and the clan had kept his most treasured possession as proof of that honor. Elijah took the knife, felt its familiar weight. He'd learned to hunt and trap using this knife, had carved Emma's doll with this blade. Now it would serve a new purpose, not as a weapon, but as a tool to mark his own oath. Without hesitation, he drew the blade across his left palm, shallow but enough to draw blood. Then he pressed his bloody palm against the cave wall beside the prophecy painting, leaving his mark. A signature written in blood and sealed with intention. "I am Elijah Cain," he said formally, speaking to Keeper, but also to whatever spirits or forces had guided this moment into being. "Son of Thomas Cain, friend to the hidden people. I swear on my blood and my father's memory that I will protect this clan with my life. I will stand between them and any who would bring them harm. This I promise until my last breath." Keeper pressed his own massive hand beside Elijah's bloody print, a handprint 3 times the size, a reminder of the disparity in physical power, but equality in spirit. Then he vocalized something that sounded almost like speech. A series of sounds that Elijah somehow understood meant acceptance, brotherhood, binding. They stood together in that ancient cave as the sun rose outside. 2 beings from different worlds, joined by shared purpose and mutual respect. The prophecy had come to pass. The bridge between worlds had been chosen. And whatever came next, whether victory or defeat, survival or sacrifice, Elijah Cain would face it with the same courage his father had shown 28 years before. Keeper led him back out of the cave as the morning light strengthened. At the entrance, the big male paused and handed Elijah something else, a small pouch containing what looked like dried herbs and powdered stone. He pantomimed rubbing it on skin, then pointed to his own chest, where scars marked old wounds. Medicine, Elijah understood. Healing herbs the clan had used on his father, now given to his son for whatever battles lay ahead. They parted at the edge of Elijah's clearing, and Keeper disappeared into the forest with the silent grace of his kind. Elijah stood for a long moment, his father's knife at his belt, the healing herbs in his pocket, the weight of prophecy on his shoulders. He'd come to these mountains 15 years ago to hide from life, to escape the pain of loss and the burden of caring. But life had found him anyway, had dragged him back into the world through an act of simple compassion on a stormy night. And now he stood at the center of something larger than himself, something his father had prepared him for without his knowing. The railroad was coming. Garrett Mason and his surveyors would return. Soon there would be construction crews and engineers and hundreds of workers swarming through these mountains. The collision his father had foreseen was inevitable, but Elijah was no longer the broken man who'd fled to isolation. He was Thomas Cain's son, bearer of the medallion, blood brother to the hidden people. He was the bridge between worlds, and he would not break easily. 2 weeks remained before the railroad company planned to begin actual construction. Elijah learned this from another trip to Timber Ridge, where he'd gone to study land records with new eyes and desperate purpose. Armed with the knowledge his father had left him, he now understood what he was looking for, not a way to stop the railroad entirely, which was impossible, but a way to redirect it, to protect the clan's territories while appearing to cooperate. The maps in the land office showed several possible routes through the mountain range. The railroad company had chosen the most direct path, straight through the heart of clan territory, cutting across the hidden valley and destroying everything the clan had built over generations. But there were alternatives. Longer routes, more expensive routes, but technically feasible. Elijah spent 3 days making careful copies of those maps, noting elevations and gradients, calculating costs in his head. He was no engineer, but he'd worked these mountains long enough to understand the land's moods and challenges. One route in particular caught his attention. A path that swung wide to the east, adding maybe 10 miles to the total distance, but avoiding the forbidden territories entirely. The question was, how to make the railroad company choose that route instead of the one they'd already surveyed and planned for. He needed leverage, something that would make the longer route more attractive than the shorter one. And he needed it fast. Back at his cabin, he laid out all his father's maps alongside the copies he'd made from the land office. Keeper visited most evenings now, their communication growing more sophisticated as they developed a shared vocabulary of gestures and sounds. Elijah showed him the maps, explained through pantomime, and drawing what the railroad meant to do. Keeper's response was to gather the clan's council, 7 elders, male and female, who came to Elijah's cabin under cover of darkness. They couldn't all fit inside, so they sat in a circle in the clearing while Elijah built a large fire to provide warmth and light. The scene was surreal. 7 massive beings covered in thick fur, illuminated by firelight, listening intently as a human tried to explain the threat facing their world. Elijah used sticks and stones to demonstrate what he'd learned. The direct route would bring destruction. The eastern route would avoid their territories, but was more difficult and expensive. The clan needed to make the direct route. Impossible without revealing their existence. One of the elders, an ancient female whose fur had gone nearly white, made a series of sounds and gestures that Keeper translated through pantomime. She was suggesting they could create obstacles on the direct route. Rock slides, fallen trees, signs of unstable ground that would make engineers think twice. Another elder disagreed, pointing out that such obvious sabotage would bring more humans, more investigation, more danger of discovery. They needed something subtler, something that would appear natural. The discussion went on for hours, and Elijah found himself marveling at their intelligence and strategic thinking. These were not simple creatures acting on instinct. They were people with complex reasoning, debating consequences, and weighing options, just as any human council would. Finally, Keeper and the white-furred elder approached Elijah with a proposal. They would allow him to bring railroad surveyors into certain areas, specific locations within what would be the direct route, where geological features made construction genuinely dangerous. Unstable slopes, underground streams that could cause sinkholes, rock formations too hard to blast through efficiently. These hazards existed, but they'd been carefully avoided by the clan for generations. The surveyors hadn't noticed them because they'd been focused on surface conditions, not the hidden dangers beneath. It was brilliant. If Elijah could convince the engineers to do more thorough geological surveys in those specific areas, they discovered genuine problems that made the direct route far more expensive and dangerous than initially calculated. The clan wasn't asking him to lie or sabotage, just to make sure the railroad company knew the full truth about what they were getting into. The next morning, Elijah rode back to Timber Ridge and requested a meeting with the railroad company's regional office. It took 3 days of waiting and being dismissed by various clerks before he finally got in to see an engineer named Samuel Barrett, a serious man in his late-50s who'd built railroads through difficult terrain from the Rockies to the Sierra. "Nevada's Mr. Kane," Barrett said, studying him over reading spectacles. "I'm told you have concerns about our planned route through Sentinel Peak." "I do," Elijah said, keeping his voice level and reasonable. "I've lived in those mountains for 15 years. I know the terrain, and I'm telling you the route you've chosen has problems your surveyors missed." Barrett's expression suggested he'd heard this before from locals who didn't want progress in their backyards. "Our survey team is quite experienced, I'm sure they are, but they surveyed in late summer when conditions were dry. They didn't see what those slopes look like in spring thaw, or how certain areas turn to soup when underground water tables rise. I've seen rock formations that look solid, but are actually layered shale that'll collapse under heavy equipment. And you're suggesting this out of the goodness of your heart? Barrett's skepticism was evident. I'm suggesting it because I don't want to watch men die when preventable disasters happen. And because if your company wastes money building on unstable ground and has to reroute later, it'll cost you 10 times what it would cost to survey properly now. Barrett studied him for a long moment. Show me on the map. Elijah had come prepared. He pulled out his carefully marked copy and pointed to 6 specific locations within the direct route, places where Keeper and the elders had identified genuine geological hazards. These areas need proper geological assessment. Not just surface surveys, but core samples, water table measurements, rock stability analysis. Barrett examined the map, his expression growing more thoughtful. You seem remarkably well informed about engineering requirements for someone who lives alone in a cabin. My father worked these mountains for 40 years before me. He taught me to read the land, and I've seen what happens when people ignore what the land is trying to tell them. These locations would add significant cost and time to our timeline, Barrett said slowly. The board isn't going to be happy about delays. The board is going to be less happy if they lose equipment and men to preventable accidents, or if they have to tear up track and rebuild because they didn't do their due diligence. Elijah leaned forward. Look, I'm not trying to stop your railroad. I understand progress is coming whether I like it or not. I'm just trying to make sure it's done right, done safe. And if your surveyors find that the direct route is more trouble than it's worth, there are other options. He pointed to the eastern route on the map. This path is longer but more stable. Better bedrock, fewer hazards, actually easier construction once you factor in all the obstacles you'll face on the direct route. Barrett was silent for a long time, studying both routes. Finally, he said, I'll recommend to the board that we conduct additional geological surveys on the direct route before proceeding. If your concerns prove valid, we'll reassess. But if you're wasting our time, Mr. Kane, you'll find the railroad has ways of expressing its displeasure with interference. I'm not wasting your time, Elijah said quietly, and I'm trying to save lives, including possibly your own. He left the meeting with no certainty about what would happen next, but with a small seed of hope planted. If Barrett was competent, and he seemed to be, he'd insist on proper surveys. And if those surveys were thorough, they'd discover exactly what Keeper had promised. Genuine hazards that made the direct route a poor choice. Back at his cabin, Elijah found more offerings from the clan. Fresh meat, herbs, and something new. A series of small wooden stakes carved with symbols. Keeper appeared that evening and showed him what they meant. The stakes were markers, indicating exactly where underground water ran, where rock was unstable, where the geological hazards were most severe. The clan had been mapping their territory for generations, and now they were sharing that knowledge to protect themselves. Elijah spent the next week placing those markers carefully, making sure they'd be visible to any survey team that came through. He made them look natural, like old boundary markers or trail signs. Nothing that would seem suspicious, but everything that would draw attention to the exact spots that needed investigation. Garrett Mason and his crew returned, as Elijah knew they would. But this time, they brought engineers and equipment for geological testing. Barrett had convinced the board to do the surveys. Mason was furious about the delay, but he couldn't overrule the engineering decisions. Elijah watched from a distance as they drilled core samples and ran tests on the areas he'd marked. He saw the engineers frown and consult their instruments. He saw them shake their heads and mark things on their maps. And he saw Mason's expression grow darker as report after report confirmed what Elijah had said. The direct route was riddled with hazards that would make construction expensive, dangerous, and potentially impossible. 2 weeks into the surveys, Barrett came to Elijah's cabin personally. "You were right," he said without preamble, "about all of it. We found underground streams that could cause catastrophic sinkholes, shale layers that would collapse under heavy loads, rock formations that would require 3 times the explosives we budgeted for, with significant risk to workers. The direct route is a death trap waiting to happen. Elijah allowed himself a careful breath. What will you do? Recommend the eastern route. It's longer and more expensive, but it's also safer and more stable. In the long run, it'll actually save money because we won't be dealing with constant emergency repairs and reconstruction. Barrett paused. I don't know how you knew all this, Kane, but you may have saved lives. The board won't be happy about the change, but they'll accept it when they see our findings. When will construction begin? Elijah asked, keeping his voice neutral. 6 months, probably. We need to resurvey the eastern route, update plans, get new materials ordered. But it'll happen. The railroad is still coming through these mountains, just not through your immediate area. After Barrett left, Elijah sat on his porch and waited. He didn't have to wait long. As the sun set, Keeper emerged from the forest, and even at a distance, Elijah could read the question in his posture. Elijah stood and walked to meet him at the edge of the clearing. They're taking the eastern route, he said, making gestures to accompany the words. Your valley is safe. Your people are safe. The relief that washed over Keeper's face was profound and unmistakable. He made a sound that might have been laughter or sobbing or both, and then he did something he'd never done before. He pulled Elijah into an embrace, careful despite his massive strength, gentle despite the emotion flooding through him. Elijah hugged him back, this impossible being who'd become family, and felt tears streaming down his own face. They'd done it. Against all odds, through careful planning and shared knowledge, they'd protected the clan without exposing them. The prophecy's promise had been fulfilled, a human standing between two worlds, choosing to protect the vulnerable rather than exploit them. When they separated, Keeper gestured toward the forest, an invitation. And that night, for the first time, Elijah walked openly into the hidden valley as the clan's honored guest and celebrated protector. The whole community gathered, males, females, young ones, elders, and they honored him with songs that sounded like wind through trees, with dances that spoke of joy and relief, with gifts crafted from materials he didn't recognize but would treasure forever. The 2 infants he'd saved were there, thriving now, growing strong. They approached him shyly and touched the medallion he wore, and their parents bowed with gratitude that needed no translation. He'd saved their children that stormy night, and in doing so, he'd saved them all. But even in the midst of celebration, Elijah felt a shadow of unease. The railroad was taking the eastern route, yes, but they were still coming to the mountains, still bringing progress and change. How long before someone else noticed signs of the clan? How long before curiosity or greed or simple accident exposed their existence? The battle was won, but the war wasn't over. It would never be over. For the rest of his life, Elijah would be standing watch, steering others away, protecting secrets that grew more vulnerable with each passing year. It was the burden his father had carried, now passed to him. And someday, perhaps, he'd pass it to another, if the clan survived long enough for there to be another generation to protect them. But that was a worry for another day. Tonight, he sat by the fire in the hidden valley, surrounded by beings who'd accepted him as family, and let himself feel the simple satisfaction of having done the right thing. Emma would have been proud, he thought. Sarah, too. And his father was surely watching somehow, satisfied that his son had proven worthy of the trust placed in him. The mountain held its secrets close, and Elijah Kane stood guard over them. A bridge between worlds, a protector of the hidden, a keeper of ancient promises made new. 3 months passed in relative peace. The railroad company began work on the eastern route, and true to Barrett's word, they stayed well away from clan territories. Elijah monitored their progress from a distance, always watchful, but the crew seemed content to focus on their work without exploring deeper into the mountain range. He should have known the peace couldn't last. Garrett. Mason hadn't forgotten or forgiven being proven wrong. Elijah learned this when he made one of his quarterly trips to Timber Ridge for supplies. The town had grown even more, swollen with railroad workers and the businesses that served them. The saloons were loud with drunken voices, and the streets were muddy from constant traffic. At the general store, the proprietor gave him a strange look when he came in. "Elijah Kane, thought you should know there's been men asking about you. City types, not railroad workers. Said they were reporters or some such, interested in the man who changed the railroad's route." Elijah's stomach tightened. "When was this?" "3 days ago. They were particularly interested in your time on the mountain, what you knew about the territory that the surveyors didn't. One of them was real curious about that medallion you wear." The medallion was tucked under his shirt now, but Elijah's hand went to it instinctively. "What did you tell them?" "Not much to tell. That you've lived up there 15 years. Keep to yourself mostly. Know the mountains better than anyone." "But Kane," the proprietor lowered his voice. "One of them mentioned Garrett Mason. Said Mason told them there was something strange about you. Something you were hiding up in those mountains." Elijah paid for his supplies quickly and left, his mind racing. Reporters meant publicity, and publicity meant attention. And attention was exactly what the clan couldn't afford. Mason must have suspected something when the geological surveys had proven so precisely accurate. He'd started asking questions, making accusations, and now he'd brought in outsiders to investigate. He rode back to his cabin faster than he should have, pushing Gus harder than was wise. When he arrived, he found Keeper waiting in the clearing, agitated. The big male gestured frantically toward the south, the direction of the railroad construction, and made sounds of distress. Elijah followed him through the forest to a vantage point overlooking the eastern route, and there he saw what had Keeper so upset. A group of men, maybe 15 of them, armed and led by Garrett Mason. They weren't on the construction site. They were heading west, into the mountains, directly toward the boundary markers his father had carved years ago. Mason had assembled a hunting party, and from the equipment they carried, rifles, rope, large cages on wagon beds, Elijah understood with sick certainty what they were hunting for. Mason had figured out there was something in these mountains worth finding, and he'd convinced others to help him find it. Elijah ran back to his cabin and grabbed his rifle and ammunition. This was the confrontation he'd hoped to avoid, the collision he'd tried to prevent. But Mason wasn't content to let it go. His pride had been wounded when the railroad changed routes, and now he wanted proof that Elijah had been protecting something. Wanted to capture it, display it, profit from it. Keeper followed Elijah back to the cabin, and their eyes met in shared understanding. The clan would have to evacuate the hidden valley immediately, go deeper into the mountains where humans couldn't easily follow. But that would take time, and with 15 armed men already heading toward their territory, time was exactly what they didn't have. Elijah strapped on his father's hunting knife and filled his pockets with ammunition. "I'll slow them down," he said to Keeper, making gestures to accompany the words. "Give your people time to move to safety. But you have to go now." "Right now?" Keeper shook his head firmly and placed his massive hand on Elijah's shoulder. He gestured to himself, then to Elijah, then made a motion that clearly meant together. He wasn't abandoning his human friend to face this threat alone. "You can't be seen," Elijah insisted. "That's exactly what they want. If they see you, if they get proof you exist, it's over. Every hunter and scientist and curiosity seeker in the country will descend on these mountains. Your people will never have peace again." Keeper's response was to gesture toward the forest, and Elijah saw other clan members emerging from the trees. 7 males, all of fighting age, all ready to defend their home. They'd heard about the threat and come to stand with Keeper and the human who'd protected them. Elijah's throat tightened. They were willing to risk exposure, risk everything, because that's what family did. They protected each other even when the odds were impossible. "All right," he said quietly. "But we do this smart. No direct confrontation if we can avoid it. We use the terrain, use their fear of the unknown. Make them think these mountains are more dangerous than any potential discovery is worth." The plan came together quickly, communicated through the shared vocabulary they'd developed. The clan males would split up, create the impression of multiple large animals moving through the forest. Make sounds, leave tracks, stay hidden, but make their presence felt. Create fear and confusion. Meanwhile, Elijah would intercept Mason's group at the boundary marker. Try to turn them back with warnings before they got too deep into clan territory. It was risky, depending on human superstition and fear to accomplish what law and reason couldn't, but it was better than open conflict, which would only end one way, with dead humans and exposed clan members. Exposure that would doom them all. Elijah made his way to the old boundary marker his father had carved, moving fast through terrain he knew by heart. He reached it just as Mason's group was approaching, and he stepped out into their path with his rifle held ready but not aimed. "That's far enough, Mason," he called out. "This is private land and you're trespassing." Mason's group stopped, but the leader sneered when he saw it was just one man. "Cain, somehow I'm not surprised to see you here. Step aside. We have legal right to survey these mountains for the railroad route, which is 10 miles east of here. This territory has nothing to do with that work, and you know it. We're investigating reports of unusual wildlife," Mason said, his tone making it clear this was a prepared excuse. "Potential dangers to our workers." "We have every right to assess the full range. There's no unusual wildlife here. Just mountains that don't take kindly to fools who don't know when to leave well enough alone." Mason laughed, and several of his men joined in. "Still protecting your secrets, old man? What is it you're hiding up here, gold? Some claim you don't want others to know about." He gestured to his armed crew. "We have 15 men. You have 1 rifle and a lot of bluster. The smart move is to step aside." Elijah didn't move. "The smart move is to turn around and forget about this. The mysteries are better left alone." That sounds like a threat. It's a promise. These mountains have ways of dealing with those who disrespect them. My father learned that. Others have learned it too. You're not the first to come looking for secrets, Mason, but you might be the first to be stupid enough to keep looking after being warned. As if on cue, a sound echoed through the forest, a deep, resonant call that was definitely not a bear, not a mountain lion. Not anything most of these men would recognize. The clan males were in position, making their presence known. Several of Mason's men shifted nervously, hands tightening on their rifles. Another call answered the first, this one from a different direction. Then another and another, until it seemed like the forest itself was alive with unseen watchers. "Just animals," Mason said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Everyone stay calm." A massive shadow moved between the trees 50 yards to their left, too large to be natural, too fast to be clearly identified. Gone before anyone could get a good look, but leaving the impression of something huge and powerful watching them. "Jesus," one of the men muttered. "What was that?" "Nothing," Mason snapped. "Just tricks of the light. Cain probably has friends hiding in the trees trying to scare us." But more shadows were moving now, circling the group, staying just out of clear sight. The clan males were doing exactly what Elijah had hoped, creating an atmosphere of menace without actually revealing themselves. The men in Mason's group were looking around frantically, rifles raised, fear overtaking their initial bravado. Elijah saw his chance. "Last warning, Mason, take your men and leave. There are things in these mountains that don't want to be found. And if you push forward, you're going to wish you'd listened to me." For a moment it seemed to be working. Several of Mason's men were openly expressing their desire to leave, their earlier confidence shaken. But Mason's pride wouldn't let him back down. He raised his own rifle, pointing it directly at Elijah. "I'm done with warnings," he snarled. "Move, or I'll move you myself." The forest erupted with sound, roars and calls from all directions, so loud and so close that Mason's entire group spun around, trying to identify the threats. And then Keeper stepped out from behind a massive pine, fully visible for the first time, his 9-foot frame towering over the humans. His eyes locked on Mason with unmistakable intent. The effect was instantaneous. 3 of Mason's men dropped their rifles and ran. Others stood frozen in shock, unable to process what they were seeing. Mason himself went pale, his rifle wavering as his hands trembled. "Impossible," he whispered. "It's impossible," but it wasn't impossible. It was real, standing before them, undeniable proof that the old stories were true. And in Mason's eyes, Elijah saw the shift from fear to greed. This was what he'd been looking for, proof of the century. This would make him famous, wealthy, legendary. Mason steadied his rifle, aiming at Keeper. "Nobody move! This creature is coming with us. We'll be rich," Elijah didn't think. He moved on pure instinct, throwing himself between Mason and Keeper as the rifle discharged. The bullet caught him in the upper shoulder, spinning him around with the impact. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his body. But he managed to keep his own rifle up, pointing it at Mason from his position on the ground. "The next person who aims at them dies," Elijah said through gritted teeth, blood soaking into his shirt. "I promise you that." The remaining men in Mason's group had seen enough. The combination of Keeper's impossible presence, Elijah's willingness to take a bullet, and the sounds of other unseen beings surrounding them broke their nerve completely. They turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush in their panic to escape. Mason was alone now, his rifle still raised, but his hands shaking. Keeper moved forward slowly, each step deliberate, his massive form radiating barely contained fury. The being who'd shown Elijah nothing but gentleness was now showing Mason exactly how dangerous his kind could be when their families were threatened. Mason backed away slowly, his rifle still raised, but clearly understanding he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. Keeper advanced, and for a moment Elijah thought the big male might actually kill the surveyor, might reach out with those massive hands and end the threat permanently. But then the two infants Elijah had saved appeared at the edge of the clearing. They were bigger now, thriving, their innocent eyes watching the confrontation with confusion. They approached Elijah where he lay bleeding on the ground, making soft sounds of distress. Keeper stopped his advance and looked back at them. His children, safe and alive because this human had chosen compassion over convenience on a stormy night. The rage in his expression shifted to something more complicated, grief perhaps, at what violence would cost them all. Elijah managed to push himself up on one elbow despite the pain radiating from his shoulder. "Don't kill him, Keeper," he said quietly. "That's not who you are. That's not who we are." Mason's rifle barrel dipped slightly, perhaps from exhaustion, perhaps from the dawning realization of what he was seeing. A wounded human protecting a creature that shouldn't exist. That creature choosing mercy over revenge. And two young ones approaching without fear, having been taught by their parents that not all humans were threats. "You shot him," Keeper said, or rather, made sounds that to Elijah's ears had become almost like speech, comprehensible through months of shared language and understanding. "Hurt family?" Mason's face went even paler. Whether from the shock of hearing the creature vocalize, or from understanding that he'd crossed an unforgivable line, Elijah couldn't tell. The other clan males emerged from the forest now, forming a circle around Mason. 7 massive beings, each capable of tearing him apart, each choosing restraint because Elijah had asked it of them. The surveyor looked around wildly, his rifle finally dropping to point at the ground as the hopelessness of his situation became clear. "Please," Mason whispered. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted proof. Just wanted people to know." "To know what?" Elijah asked, forcing himself to stand despite the waves of dizziness washing over him. Blood was running down his arm, dripping from his fingertips. "That they exist? That they're real? And what happens then, Mason? What happens when every hunter and scientist and curiosity seeker in the country descends on these mountains looking for their own proof?" Mason had no answer, or perhaps he'd simply never thought that far ahead, never considered the consequences beyond his own fame and fortune. One of the infants, the larger one that Elijah had warmed by his fire all those months ago, approached Mason cautiously. The surveyor stumbled backward, his rifle forgotten, his eyes wide with wonder and terror. The infant reached out one small hand and touched the barrel of Mason's dropped rifle, then looked up at him with those impossibly intelligent eyes. It was a moment of perfect clarity, Mason seeing not a monster or a curiosity, but a child, a being capable of wonder and trust, looking at him without hatred despite what he'd done. The surveyor's face crumpled and he sank to his knees in the snow. "They're people," he said, his voice breaking. God help me, they're people. Elijah swayed on his feet, the blood loss making the world tilt. Keeper was beside him instantly, supporting him with careful strength. The big male pulled something from his pouch, the healing herbs he'd given Elijah weeks ago, and pressed them against the bullet wound, packing it despite Elijah's sharp intake of breath. "You need help," Keeper vocalized. The concern unmistakable. "I'll be fine," Elijah lied, though he wasn't at all sure of that. The bullet had gone through, which was good, but he was losing too much blood. "We need to deal with him first." He nodded toward Mason, who was still kneeling in the snow. His worldview clearly shattered. Keeper made a gesture to the other clan males, and they moved closer to Mason, but didn't threaten. They simply stood there, a living wall of impossible beings, waiting to see what would happen next. "You have a choice," Elijah said to Mason, his voice steady despite the pain. "You can go back to town and tell everyone what you saw. Bring back armies of men with guns and cages. Watch these people, and that's what they are, people, get hunted down and destroyed. Or, Mason's voice was hollow, or you accept that some mysteries are worth protecting. You keep this secret, let these mountains keep their hidden communities, and you walk away knowing you did the right thing for once in your miserable life." "Who would believe me anyway?" Mason said bitterly. "Even with a dozen witnesses, they'd think we were drunk or insane. And if I somehow proved it—" He looked at the infants, at Keeper's protective stance, at the other clan members watching with wary intelligence. "If I proved it, I'd be responsible for destroying them. I'd be the man who ended something ancient and beautiful because I couldn't let go of my pride." Sheriff William Harding appeared through the trees then, drawn by the gunshot, accompanied by 3 deputies. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, their eyes going wide as they took in the scene. The massive beings surrounding Mason, Elijah, bleeding from a bullet wound, the impossible reality of what stood before them. "Lord, have mercy," one deputy whispered, his hand moving to his sidearm. "Don't," Elijah commanded, his voice carrying despite his weakness. "They haven't hurt anyone. Mason shot me, not them. They're just protecting their families, same as any of us would." The sheriff was a practical man who'd spent 30 years dealing with the realities of frontier life. He looked at the clan members, at their tools and organization, at the way they positioned themselves between the humans and what must be their young. "They're intelligent," he said slowly. "Organized, they're not animals." "No," Elijah agreed. "They're people. They've lived in these mountains for generations, maybe centuries, hurting no one, asking nothing, just trying to survive in peace." Harding studied the scene for a long moment, his hand resting on his gun, but not drawing it. "What happened here, Kane?" "Mason brought armed men into protected territory looking for—" Elijah gestured weakly at the clan. "Looking for proof of stories he should have left alone. I tried to turn them back. He shot me. These people came to my defense. That's all." "That's not all," Harding said quietly. "This changes everything. If word gets out, then word can't get out." Mason interrupted, standing slowly. "I was wrong. I brought men into dangerous territory, got spooked by wildlife, accidentally shot Kane in the confusion. That's the story. That's the only story anyone needs to hear." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You're willing to lie to protect them?" "I'm willing to tell the truth that matters," Mason said. "Which is that these mountains should be left alone. Some places aren't meant for railroads, or settlements, or progress. Some places should stay wild." He looked at Keeper. "I'm sorry. For everything. I'll make sure no one else comes looking." Keeper regarded him for a long moment, then nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement if not quite forgiveness. He vocalized something that sounded almost like acceptance, and the other clan members relaxed their defensive postures slightly. The sheriff looked at his deputies. "You men saw nothing unusual here today, just a hunting accident, a dispute over territory that got out of hand. Understood?" The deputies nodded, their eyes still wide but their expressions showing they understood what was at stake. Good men, Elijah thought. The kind who understood that sometimes the law had to bend to serve a higher justice. "Kane needs a doctor," Harding said, moving forward to help support Elijah's weight. And then we all need to have a long discussion about how we're going to keep this secret for the rest of our natural lives. As they helped Elijah toward the horses the sheriff's party had left tied beyond the clearing, he looked back at Keeper and the clan. The big male raised one massive hand in farewell, and the infants mimicked the gesture, their small hands waving. Goodbye to the human who'd saved their lives and protected their world. The prophecy had been fulfilled. The bridge between worlds had stood firm, and though the cost had been paid in blood and pain, the clan would survive, their secret protected by good men who understood that some truths were worth more than fame or fortune or progress. Elijah let himself be led away, consciousness starting to fade from blood loss, but satisfied that he'd honored his father's promise. The watch might have stopped at 3:47, but Elijah's time was still running. And as long as it ran, the clan would have a protector standing between them and a world that would never understand what it was destroying. Spring came to the mountains 6 months after the confrontation, bringing with it the kind of renewal that made a man believe in second chances. Elijah stood on his porch in the warm morning sunlight, his shoulder fully healed now, thanks to the clan's medicines and the town doctor's care. The scar was still there, a permanent reminder of the day he'd stood between two worlds, but it didn't pain him anymore. The railroad had been completed on the eastern route, exactly as planned. Trains now ran through the mountains twice a week, bringing prosperity to Timber Ridge and connecting the territory to the wider world. But the clan's lands remained untouched, their secret preserved by the careful silence of those who'd witnessed the impossible. Sheriff Harding had proven himself a man of his word. He'd filed a report describing a hunting accident and a territorial dispute. Nothing more. Mason had left the territory entirely, taking a position with a railroad company in Montana, and from what Elijah heard, he'd become an advocate for preserving wilderness areas, speaking passionately about the need to leave some places untouched by progress. A strange redemption for a man who'd nearly destroyed what he'd sought to capture. The deputies who'd been there that day kept the secret as well. And in the months since, they'd become unofficial guardians of the clan's territories, quietly steering hunters and explorers away from the forbidden lands. A network of protectors had formed, all bound by the memory of that day, when they'd seen something that changed their understanding of what was possible. Elijah heard footsteps approaching through the forest and smiled before he even turned around. He'd learned to recognize Keeper's distinctive gait, the careful way the big male moved to avoid startling the local wildlife. The massive being emerged from the tree line, and beside him walked the two infants, not so small anymore, growing rapidly into adolescence. They'd become regular visitors to Elijah's cabin, the youngsters fascinated by human tools and customs, Keeper content to sit on the porch and share companionable silence with his friend. It was these visits that filled the empty spaces in Elijah's life, that transformed his solitude from painful isolation into peaceful contentment. The youngsters bounded ahead, excited as always, and made the gesture that Elijah had taught them meant greeting. He responded in kind, then pulled out the small carved animals he'd been working on, gifts he'd learned the young ones treasured. Their faces lit up with joy, and they settled on the porch to examine the carvings while making soft sounds of appreciation. Keeper joined Elijah at the porch rail, looking out over the clearing that had become neutral ground, a place where two species could meet in friendship. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, as they often did, communication happening in ways that went beyond words. Finally, Keeper reached into his pouch and withdrew something that made Elijah's breath catch. It was a pocket watch, not his father's watch, which still rested in the sacred cave, but a new one crafted with remarkable skill. The case was carved from some dark wood Elijah didn't recognize, polished until it gleamed. Inside, the mechanism was made from materials that seemed to blend stone and metal in ways he couldn't begin to understand. But it worked. When Keeper handed it to him and Elijah opened the case, the hands were moving, ticking steadily forward. Keeper had crafted a timepiece using the clan's ancient knowledge, a gift that spoke volumes about the depth of their culture and the value they placed on their friendship with this human. Elijah's eyes burned with emotion as he accepted it. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. I don't have words for what this means." Keeper made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or affection or both, and placed his massive hand gently on Elijah's shoulder, the one that hadn't been shot, a consideration that showed how well he understood human fragility. The youngsters had noticed the exchange and came over to see, making excited sounds when they saw the watch. One of them pointed to the old nail on the wall where Elijah's father's watch had once hung, then to the new watch, then to Elijah's heart. The message was clear. Time moves forward, but memory and love remain. Elijah carefully hung the new watch on the nail, in the place of honor his father's watch had occupied for so long. It was a symbolic act, a recognition that while he honored the past, he was finally living in the present. His father's promise had been kept. The prophecy had been fulfilled. And now, instead of being frozen at 347, Elijah's life was moving forward with purpose and meaning. Throughout the day, other clan members visited, bringing offerings and simply spending time in the clearing. It had become their custom, these gatherings at Elijah's cabin, a celebration of the bond that had formed between species, a reminder that family could be found in the most unexpected places. The white-furred elder came, the one whose wisdom had helped plan their defense against the railroad. She brought seeds from the clan's gardens, special varieties they'd cultivated over generations, and showed Elijah through patient pantomime how to plant and tend them. It was a gift of knowledge, a sharing of culture that honored the trust between them. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber, the clan members gradually departed back to their hidden valley, but the youngsters lingered, reluctant to leave, and Keeper allowed them to stay a while longer, understanding their attachment to the human who'd saved their lives. Elijah told them stories as darkness fell, sitting on his porch with the two young ones curled at his feet like large, fur-covered children. He told them about Emma, about how she'd loved stories of heroes and adventures. He told them about Sarah, about the family he'd lost and the family he'd found. And though they couldn't understand all his words, they understood the emotion behind them, the love and loss and hope that colored every sentence. When Keeper finally gathered his youngsters to leave, Elijah walked with them to the edge of the clearing. The big male paused there and did something he'd never done before. He vocalized in a way that sounded remarkably close to human speech. "Brother," he said, the word clumsy but unmistakable. "Family." Elijah felt tears streaming down his face, but they were good tears, cleansing tears. "Brother," he agreed. "Family." After they'd disappeared into the darkening forest, Elijah returned to his cabin and sat at his table with his father's journal open before him. He'd been adding to it regularly, chronicling everything that had happened, creating a record that might someday guide another protector if one was needed. But tonight, he wrote something different. "I came to these mountains 15 years ago to hide from life, to escape the pain of loss. I thought by removing myself from the world, I could remove the possibility of being hurt again. I was wrong. Life found me anyway, in the form of two small creatures freezing in a blizzard, and in saving them, I saved myself. I understand now what my father tried to teach me, what he learned from Keeper and the clan. That family isn't just about blood. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. That some secrets are worth protecting, even at great cost, because they represent something precious and irreplaceable. The watch my father left me stopped at 3:47, marking the moment his time ended. But Keeper has given me a new watch, one that keeps perfect time, that moves steadily forward into an unknown future. It's a reminder that while we honor the past, we must live in the present and build toward the future. I am no longer the lonely mountain man who ran from the world. I am Elijah Kane, son of Thomas Kane, blood brother to the hidden people, guardian of sacred secrets. I have a family that spans species, a purpose that gives meaning to each day, and a legacy to uphold that stretches back generations and will, if I'm faithful to it, extend forward for generations to come. Emma would be proud, I think, Sarah too, and my father is surely at peace, knowing his son proved worthy of the trust placed in him. The mountains hold their secrets close, and I stand watch over them, a bridge between worlds, a keeper of promises, a protector of the hidden. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life I was meant for. And for the first time since I lost Sarah and Emma, I can say without reservation that I'm grateful to be alive. He closed the journal and walked to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. Somewhere in the darkness, the clan slept peacefully in their hidden valley, secure in the knowledge that they had allies in the human world. And in towns and settlements throughout the territory, good men and women kept the secret, understanding that some mysteries were worth more than fame or fortune. The new pocket watch ticked steadily on the wall, measuring time that was no longer frozen, no longer stopped at a moment of loss. Instead, it measured moments of connection, of purpose, of love found in unexpected places. Elijah Kane had come to the mountains to die, slowly and alone. Instead, he'd learned to live again, fully and connected. The lonely mountain man had found his family, his purpose, his place in a story larger than himself. And as he prepared for bed, wrapped in the miraculous blanket the clan had woven, with the medallion warm against his chest and the sound of the forest singing its night song, Elijah felt something he hadn't felt in 15 long years. He felt at home. The next morning would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to honor the promises made and kept. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, he was simply a man who'd learned that sometimes the family we find chooses us as much as we choose them. And sometimes protecting what others don't understand is the greatest act of courage a person can perform. The mountain held its secrets close. The clan slept in peace. The railroad ran its course far from forbidden lands, and Elijah Kane stood guard, a